Hello, everybody. I think we've got critical mass, so it's time to get our program started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Fleischer, and I'm president of BCW's Washington, D.C. office. I wanted to say thank you for joining us today for the second in our four-part BCW election series. Today's event, moderated by BCW's own Izzy Santa, Senior Vice President in our public affairs practice, who has a lot of deep technology experience in the sector. We'll dive into digital democracy and election integrity. Obviously, some terms we've heard a lot about recently, as we saw with the discussion around these issues continuing at last night's vice presidential debate. I think this will be a very timely and relevant discussion as we see survey data telling us that voters are more frustrated and in some ways anxious than they ever have been. Obviously, with the severe national crisis from COVID-19 pandemic, including the president's recovery and many other very positive cases at the highest levels of government, to sort of the civil and social unrest we've seen around inequality issues, to things like the wildfires and hurricanes. So it's understandable that that level of anxiety is high. And with uncertainty around surrounding the time it may take to count votes, there's been a lot of discussion of that we'll get into today too, accurately, and to determine who the winner of the presidential election is, there's a probability that we'll experience some more intense, anxious moments as the nation sort of waits on the impact of the election. And it's very possible, or I would say even likely, that there will be pressure on brands and companies to become sort of soothers in chief, so to speak, as election day approaches, and certainly potentially even after election day. So our public affairs and crisis practice, along with our partner PSB Insights, which is part of BCW Group, have been providing research and insights throughout this series of election events to help clients navigate these complicated issues, and I think none more so in some ways than what we're going to discuss today. So very much look forward to a vigorous discussion, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to our own Izzy Santa to start the conversation.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining. Let me present to you today's speakers. With us today, we have Amy Crosby, Vice President of PSB Insights, Liz Howard, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law, a public policy institute focused on campaign finance, voting, elections, and ethics. And finally, CNN political commentator, founder of Convergence Media, and former Chief of Staff at the RNC, Mike Shields. Thank you so much, you guys, for joining. This means a lot to us and to our clients and our guests. So let me tell you a little bit about today's conversation. We're going to spend 3 to 5 minutes with Amy, and she's going to go over recent polling results. Then we're going to spend about 30 minutes or so with Liz and Mike, and they're going to react to those results and really tell us what this really means in a very high level that you and I could understand. And then we're going to spend the last 10 minutes with Q&A, so our guests and audience members can ask questions to the panelists. So let's get started. Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Izzy. PSB Insights conducted a series of polls among likely voters to better understand how Americans are planning to vote, what concerns they have, and what their expectations are for Election Day. So last month, we interviewed over 1,500 likely voters in the US, and these are defined as registered voters who indicate they're very or somewhat likely to vote in the upcoming election. The first thing we set out to understand, as you can see on this slide, is simply how Americans plan to vote this year. And what we found was that the COVID-19 pandemic is driving significantly more Americans to cast their ballots by mail. 39% of Americans say they will be voting by mail this year. That's nearly twice as many as those who voted by mail in 2016. Among those choosing to vote by mail, concerns about exposure to coronavirus are the top driver, followed by the overall convenience of the option. Now, it's worth noting, as you can see in the lower left corner, that even with this higher number, a majority of Americans still plan to vote in person. And this is even higher among Republicans, 69% of whom are voting in person versus 48% of Democrats. Our survey also found that nearly half of American voters have some concerns about mail-in voting. However, this looks starkly different when broken down by party. Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats to have concerns about mail-in voting. And the top concerns themselves also differ by party. As you can see in the chart on the right side of the screen, Republicans are much more likely to be worried about possible fraud, while Democrats are more likely to have concerns around their ballot not being counted in time. Now, voting procedures aren't the only issues driving the news this year. There's also ample evidence of attempts by Russia and China to interfere in the US election process. Regarding this subject, Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to have concerns about foreign election interference. And I should note that this concern involves both direct interference with campaigns and the voting process, as well as disinformation campaigns on social media. Now, traditionally, it's expected that a presidential winner will be declared, if not necessarily certified, on election night. However, this year, less than half of Americans expect to know who the winner is within 24 hours of polls closing. And I think what's interesting here is that this is the one area where there weren't significant differences by party or by demographic subgroups. I think given the unprecedented circumstances facing us, it's clear that the country as a whole is shifting their expectations this time around. And with that, I will throw it back to Izzy and our panelists, Liz and Mike.
Thank you so much, Amy. So as the research shows, Republicans are more worried about mail-in voting fraud, and Democrats are more primarily worried about foreign interference. So I'm going to open the conversation by asking you both, starting with you, Liz, and then Mike, the same question. Do Democrat districts face more voter frauds than others? Or is it just that the president's rhetoric is influencing Republican voters? Why the split across the party lines?
Thank you, Izzy. President Trump's attacks on election officials and our election infrastructure and the security measures is absolutely having a negative impact on some voters. Unfortunately, now, voters are aware that, of what President Trump has said, but they are unaware of all of the election integrity procedures that their local election officials implement to make sure that voting by mail is safe and secure. It is a long list. And we certainly think that voting by mail is secure. And I think the most important piece for this election for everyone is to go ahead and vote early, because certainly, as you've mentioned, the number of absentee ballots that are going to be cast this year are unprecedented. And certainly our election infrastructure is under strain for many reasons, including the fact that it has been chronically underfunded for years. And the earlier that everyone can vote, the easier it will be for election officials to, work to tabulate the results and make sure that all of the vote by mail ballots are cast by eligible voters and counted as cast.
Mike?
Yeah, look, the country is polarized. You can take any issue there is, and people may be on whatever side they would normally be on an issue, and the minute President Trump picks a side, all of a sudden becomes polarized, and the Republicans are all on the president's side, and the Democrats are against the president. And masks, going back to school, things to do with COVID are no different, and voting is certainly no different than that. And so certainly the president's had a huge impact on telling Republican voters to be wary of mass ballots being mailed to people. Before the president, though, if you'd looked at data, Republicans tended to like to vote in person more anyway. So this was already a trend that was there. Older voters, which in the past also had, the bigger part of the Republican coalition, tended to want to vote in person. There was sort of a distrust there in voting by mail. And so the president has exacerbated that with his comments, and it has sort of made even larger a trend that already existed in terms of how people behaved with early voting and voting by mail.
So we still know, though, that there's a lot of confusion out there, even though there's lots of efforts by lots of nonprofit groups to educate voters. But I think some voters are still confused of how to vote, where to vote. So Liz, can you explain to us what are the core options available to voters? What are some examples that you are seeing going on that has worked really well in voting? And is there a difference between absentee ballots, drop by mail, or just anything else that you want to tell the group to really get them encouraged to go vote, or just to understand how each state process is different?
So as we all know, we have a very decentralized election administration system here in the United States, which, from some perspectives is a great benefit, because it makes it more challenging for a widespread attack to have an impact across the entire country. However, it does require voters to be informed about the options available in their state. However, every state is going to have allow for voters to vote prior to the election, whether that's early in-person voting, whether that's mail-in voting, or some other option. I think, you know, from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is an agency at DHS, their current advice to voters is the 3 Ps. So first, we want you to plan to vote, and that is going to require you to figure out the actual, the requirements in your state and the options in your state, so that you, as the voter, can pick whichever one is going to work best for you. Then, of course, we want you to participate. So we need you to go vote. And third of the 3 Ps from CISA is to be patient. Election officials across the country are working 20+ hours a day over the weekend. They are desperately trying to ensure that every voter has the opportunity to vote and that they are responsive, which is a challenge under these circumstances when so many voters have questions, so many voters are contemplating voting by mail, many of which have never done so in the past. And so patience might be required, but our election officials are working to make sure that everybody can vote.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, of course, states govern their own election laws, and then they're administered down at the local level, and they vary. They're different from state to state. They're different from different areas. I mean, even the equipment they have. Some areas have, you know, electronic machines. Some have paper ballots, and so it really is. It is different depending on where you are, what kind of resources are put into it, and then on top of that, because of COVID, you've had what was already a system that sometimes, as she pointed out, struggles to be funded and sort of reflects the area that it's in and the resources they have is what their voting equipment and their systems are like. Then you add COVID on top of that, where you have put that system under pressure because of the way people are having to behave in the pandemic. And then you add on top of that the politics of COVID, which is something different, which is the political parties trying to take advantage of COVID to bend the laws in their direction, and the sort of fight that goes back and forth on how we govern our elections. You know, people are now, I mean, I just looked, there are still nationally 345 cases, just COVID related cases in court being adjudicated over election laws. And so what you're going to see is that, and I think, you know, Liz can speak a little bit more to this as an expert in the field, but you already have a system that was under pressure, and now you're putting even more pressure on it because you're changing the laws midstream. And so there are jurisdictions where just this year a law has been changed or regulation has been changed, for instance, to move to all mail balloting, but none of the people who tabulate the ballots or count the ballots are ready for all mail balloting. For instance, if they had machines before and now they're going to get paper ballots, how they react to that, what they have to do to count those ballots, the number of staff they need is significant. It's a change. And it's not as though they had 2 years to run up to that. They've now had 6 months to run up to it. And so I think there's layer upon layer of things that can be complicated with how the votes are counted.
So with that said, maybe we can get a little bit into maybe the politics of this. So Democrats are far outpacing Republicans on absentee voting requests, according to Politico. And even Amy's research shows, and has similar findings, that 47% of Democrats say they plan by voting by mail, 27% versus 27% of Republicans. So how do you interpret these results? Like, are you behind the ball? Like, you meaning the party, the Trump campaign? And as you think about answering that question, address this point if you can. Does the president's rhetoric on vote by mail impact the GOP's efforts?
Yeah, look, traditionally speaking, Democrats have taken part in early voting and vote by mail anyway. One of the things that we have battled, for instance, in the state of Iowa, I'll give you an example. Every presidential election, numbers start coming out from the Secretary of State in Iowa showing Democrats having a lead. And people model the voters, they can tell who's voted. And Republicans know that if we can not get beaten that badly in the early vote, then we are going to have, historically we can sort of figure out what our election day vote is going to be, and we can kind of gauge whether or not we're going to win or lose. But the media story is always, well, you're losing, so you're losing. And it's like, yeah, but all of our voters show up on election day, and so they're not beating us by enough votes in early vote to succeed on election day. And you kind of get into these arguments. A lot of those historical, and that's based on history, right? A lot of that's been thrown out the window now. During COVID, how can you historically look at Iowa's early vote and consider it to be a comp to previous presidential elections? Because during the pandemic, everyone's behavior is different. And so it's sort of disorienting for political professionals to look in the state of Florida and try to understand where are these voters. Now, what it comes back to is how sophisticated is your data operation? How much can you look at what you're seeing come through and readjust your strategy? It certainly affects your election strategy. Look, voter intensity is incredibly high. It's the highest it's been in our lifetimes for a presidential election. And so people want to vote, and they're going to figure out a way to vote. And in surveys, what you will see with Democrats who are really motivated to vote in this election, they will tell you, if you ask them, how is it you're going to vote and when are you going to vote? And they will say, I'm going to vote as soon as I legally can. And so they are certainly surging early on in the vote. And I believe that's affected the campaign strategies of the two campaigns. As Democrats know that they have an advantage early, and Republicans are waiting for their sort of late surge to come. And then, yes, of course, the president has basically told his voters, go out and vote at the end and don't use vote by mail. He's continued to say that. On the other side, Democrats in general, when it comes to the pandemic, have said be more afraid. Take more precautions. That is sort of the mindset of their party is to tell, through the media, through their surrogates, be much more careful. You should vote by mail. So they are also telling their voters to take part more in a vote by mail or early vote system. And Republicans are telling their voters to vote later. And guess what? That's what's happening.
But like you just said, what is wrong with voting by mail? I guess I'll punt it to you, Liz, and then Mike, you can react. But is there something fundamentally wrong with us voting by mail? And is there a world maybe 10 years, not even 10 years, 4 years from now, where forget paper, let's go digital? What is so wrong with voting by mail? Really explain it to us.
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but voting by mail is secure. We've had voting by mail in this country since at least the Civil War. And again, going back to CISA, so the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, they just came out with a chart this week explaining the security features and the election integrity safeguards that are inherent in the vote by mail process across the country. So that's going to include features that allow voters to track their ballot, where their ballot is in the mail coming back. It's going to include election mail indicia so that the United States Post Office mail carriers are aware that there is important mail in that envelope. It's going to include signature verification, voter authentication, and a number of election integrity measures that are applied to all votes that come in via the mail, whether they're from Republicans or Democrats. And just to go back to Iowa, there's a Republican Secretary of State in Iowa, Secretary Pate, who is generally exceptionally solid, has done a really good job of promoting election security measures across the state and is wonderful in so many ways. However, I think Secretary Pate, and there are multiple Republican secretaries across the country who have responded not only to President Trump's attack on vote by mail, but in addition, his attacks on the mail drop-off boxes. So these are the drop boxes that voters can return their mail in that are very similar to USPS blue boxes that you'll be familiar with. Secretary Pate has decided that drop boxes are not permissible. So this is just one of the measures. The drop boxes are one of the measures that make it easier for people to return their ballot and have it voted. You've also seen Secretary LaRose in Ohio, who has decided to limit the number of drop boxes per county to 1. So you have a county such as Cuyahoga, such as Franklin, where you have big metro areas and thousands of people that are limited to to 1 drop box, just as a county such as Defiance County, Ohio, that has 25,000 voters. And you've most recently seen this come up in Texas, where Harris County, which has millions of voters, is limited now to 1 drop box, versus other more rural counties in Texas that have maybe a few thousand registered voters and who have access to 1 drop box.
Mike, there's a lot in there. Which one do you want to tackle first?
Well, yeah, you're really asking me the core question of why does President Trump say this? I mean, what problem do Republicans have with vote by mail, right? And I think, first of all, I personally don't share some of that. I'm fine with vote by mail. I think vote by mail actually, from a campaign perspective, benefits the more organized campaign. And right now, in this election, Republicans actually have a more sophisticated ground game and data operation than the Biden campaign does. So I actually think that organizing around vote by mail is somewhat would be easier for us. But look, what the president is talking about is a concern about fraud, about election integrity. And while I share I don't believe that there is a widespread sort of conspiracy on this. There have been number of incidences of lack of integrity around mail-in ballots. That is a problem. And so as long as that is a problem, it's going to be talked about. For instance, ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting, and let me also be really blunt about this. When it comes to election law, there's sort of a field within which all of the election laws live. And the Democrats try to bend it to their side, and they do things that will benefit them to win elections, and they will use arguments like racism or access for voters, and in reality, they're just trying to win. And Republicans try to bend the lines over here, and they use things like security and integrity and making sure that people are secure, and they're trying to win. And all of these election laws live within this sort of spectrum, and so the two parties fight each other, and they use a lot of attacks as to why and on the motives for why one side is doing it and the other side is doing it. And we should all just understand that this is about power and about winning elections and about doing what they can to do it. From a Republican perspective, obviously, if you are going to have the ability to mail ballots out to people that aren't even eligible to vote, that should be a concern. And there have been a lot of incidences of people seeing that ballots get mailed to people that aren't eligible to vote. And so the last sort of example I'll give you on this is in North Carolina's 9th congressional district in the 2018 election. The election was thrown into turmoil, and a special election was called when the representative had to step down because one of his staffers was doing something called ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is where someone goes around and collects other people's ballots on their behalf, harvests them, and then takes them and puts them somewhere into a box or brings them to a voter center. There are huge concerns over that, and it is illegal in North Carolina to ballot harvest. The Democratic Party lawyers that argued in that case to say, yes, this election should be overturned, there was ballot harvesting, that's illegal, were the same lawyers that were arguing in Arizona and California to create ballot harvesting laws and make it legal in the state of California. And so they're on one hand are arguing this is illegal, how terrible this is to do ballot harvesting, how dare these guys do this. And in another state, another forum, we're saying, we should allow ballot harvesting. I mean, of course you should do that. What if someone can't take their ballot in? I mean, why would you want to deny them the right to vote? How dare you deny their right to vote? If someone needs to have someone show up and take their ballot for them, well, that just makes common sense. And so that gives you an example of how confusing this can be when you're fighting over these election laws where they are different in different states and people are arguing on both sides of them. And obviously, an issue like ballot harvesting raises a lot of concerns. If I have a ballot and give it to an election official, I have at least a reasonable understanding that there's been integrity there between I'm the voter and the election official gets it. If there's a conduit between us, I don't know what happened to my ballot, and that person is not certified to or qualified to do anything with my ballot. And there's a lot of political malfeasance that can go on there. And so I'm just giving you that as one example as to why Republicans, why the president, why those folks get concerned about the integrity of their ballots when you just mail them out to everybody.
I mean, that's really great to share. So, Liz, I saw you smiling when ballot harvesting came through. The audience members can't see you, but I saw you. So I'm going to give you the opportunity, should you choose to react. Is there anything you want to add before I go to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I don't think that these are partisan issues. I think that this is a question about our democracy, and to the extent that Democrats or anyone else are fighting to make it easier for eligible citizens to participate in the franchise, I think that's important, not just as a political play, but for the future of our country. And I think that the Democrats are working in some of the examples that Mike cited to ensure that we have a fair playing field. Whatever the rules are, we need to abide by them. And, if he, the term ballot harvesting, I don't think is an accurate representation of what in reality happens on the ground in a lot of states where you have people and voters that live in areas where they don't have easy access either to a mailbox or other sort of option to return their ballot and need help. I mean, this might be your grandmother who is in a facility. This might be your elderly neighbor. And the most important piece here, certainly as we roll into November 2020, is to know what the rules are so that we can all play by the same rule.
Thank you for that. So we know from the 2016 Election Assistance Commission that 33 million ballots were mailed and 73,000 arrived late, and so therefore they weren't counted. So I suspect the same thing might happen this year, maybe even worse. So Mike, if the race is too close to be called, is there a scenario where you see campaigns going to court head-to-head to fight for these ballots? Or do you think, what is going to be the court challenge landscape from your perspective that the Republicans are going to try to lead, especially in the battleground states?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, people are already in court, and that's why I looked that up to get the case number. There's 345 cases open across the country, and I think just about every state. And a lot of those cases are teeing up election night challenges. So they're challenging a law now and trying to get in front of a judge because they know on election night they're going to try and challenge it another way. What people don't realize is it happens every election. You may realize it if it's in your area. So you may have seen in the news that your local congressman or state senator or someone had an election challenge and it went to court. If you live in Florida, you certainly know about it because you probably remember back to 2000 where it wound up in court. But even in 2018, the Senate race there was so close that things wound up in court. And you have all kinds of challenges for things like signature verification, a lot of ballot integrity issues. What kind of mark was someone making? What was their intention on their ballot? That goes back to 2000 for the people that may not remember. In the presidential election, Bush v. Gore, which came down to a recount in the state of Florida. Florida at that point had punch holes called chads in their ballots, and they were trying to determine, well, is a hanging chad been all the way punched through, or was it an accident? And so that's the kind of legal challenge that you can have, and you're already seeing it. And now I think we're going to see it sort of at historic levels. Both parties are gearing up for this. Both parties are laying the framework, not just at the presidential level, all the way down through all the different elections, and partly because we've had a little bit of a rush to change election laws during the pandemic. Again, I believe people taking advantage of the pandemic to accomplish some of the political goals they had for election laws that they've been trying to get done for years, and those being challenged. And so, yes, the summary is I believe that there is a scenario on election night where you're going to have quite a few elections being challenged. The laws have just been changed. How adept were the local officials at executing those laws? What resources were they given? Did they make mistakes when they were doing it? Therefore, that election can be challenged in court. Both sides are going to go to battle over that on many elections.
I know recently I was reading the news, and the Republican Party won a court case in South Carolina, I think. Can you tell folks about that case? Because I think it's a very telling case.
Yeah, so it's an election law that has to do with someone having to have a notary over for their ballot. So there's some states where they will say you can vote absentee, but to verify and make sure you're the one who's actually filling out the ballot, because you're not walking into a polling place with your driver's license so they can see who you are, that we would want someone to notarize that you that's the ballot you filled out. And so this is exactly what I'm talking about. These kinds of laws, well, for instance, in the state of Missouri, the governor got a law passed that said if you're over 65, you don't need the notary requirement because seniors are more susceptible to COVID, and therefore, they should be able to return their ballots without a notary, but everyone else has to have a notary, and that was also challenged in court. And so those are the kinds of court challenges you're going to see, which some of them go all the way up to constitutional issues of, well, what rights does someone have to vote? What right do we have to make sure that there's integrity in the vote? What measures can we take to make sure that it's safe? And how do we change that during a pandemic? And so South Carolina is one of the examples of that.
Liz, I think you're the only attorney in the room. I am not. So I would love to get your perspective on the landscape of what do you think it's going to come down to have election results, right? 1, 2, that they're on time somehow. And do you think this is all going to go to the Supreme Court somehow? Do you have any forecasting you want to share with us?
Well, I think, again, going back to what I was talking about earlier, where every state has different rules, different regulations, and as Mike said, right, like each state is responsible for administering elections, which is generally the responsibility of the local election official. So every state has different restrictions on when the local election officials can start to process and tabulate the absentee ballots that are coming in. And as we discussed, there are unprecedented numbers of absentee ballots that are coming in. So we've seen many state legislatures respond to the urgent requests of their election officials asking for authorization to start this process, this pre-processing process where they can go in and individually verify that each voter, the ballot is from an eligible voter and that the vote should be counted long before Election Day, because there's going to be so much pressure to tabulate all of the absentee ballots that they have received as soon as possible. So the map that we currently have right now is that the majority of states that are reliably and traditionally very red and or blue have allowed their election officials to start pre-processing their absentee ballots before Election Day. And so that's going to give those states a much better chance of having a more complete election night results than about 6 other states, where the election officials including the 3 battlegrounds of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are not going to be allowed to even start verifying that the votes received, that the envelopes received back have valid votes in them until Election Day. I will say Michigan just gave their election officials about an additional 10 hours before Election Day to start this process, but that's kind of a fig leaf on this problem. So on election night, which I want to go back and reiterate, we have not had complete election night results for decades. At minimum, there will be provisional ballots where a voter has gone to a polling location and there's a question about whether or not they're in the correct polling location or whether or not they're a registered voter. Those voters will be given provisional ballots, which are adjudicated on an individual basis in the days following the election. And again, to talk about what election officials do, election officials tabulate ballots. They do not call elections. The press has historically taken the results that they have on election night, which again are incomplete, and projected who the winner is. The reason that this is such an issue this year is because there are suggestions that this race is going to be very close, which is going to make it more difficult for the press to do their job. Election officials are going to continue to do their job in this election just as they've done in every other election in the past. But the map on election night is likely to include the 3 very important states in this election having significantly incomplete results that the press will not be able to use to reliably predict who's going to win that state. And that is not because the election officials are not doing a good job. That is simply because in those 3 states, the Republican legislature has failed to provide the relief that the election officials have desperately sought. So it depends on how things go in many other states, but it's very possible that we won't have complete results in those 3 states, at least, probably multiple other states, for at least a couple of days after the election. And I think the press has actually done, and this bears out in your polling, the press has actually done it, been helpful in explaining and educating the voters about what's going on and why the press is may not be able to call the election on election night.
So it's clear that all politics is local, but also all voting infrastructure is also very local. So I guess to you, Liz, is there a state that is doing it really well that can serve as a model moving forward and we can learn some lessons from them now? And what is a state that you're like, this is a perfect example of a state that needs more resources to pull it off?
Well, as an initial point, I think that all the states need more resources, especially in the middle of a pandemic, to conduct safe and secure elections. But however, when we think about this from an election security standpoint, election security is kind of a 3-legged stool. So basically, you want to have paper ballots, you want to have post-election audits, and you want to have good cybersecurity practices across the board. And a couple of things that are easy to measure, so we talk about them frequently, have to do, and Mike hit on this earlier, right? Some states continue to use paperless voting machines, which is a security vulnerability because there's no way to go back and confirm that you have the accurate vote count. But in good news, we only have 8 states that continue to use paperless voting machines anywhere, and only 1 state that uses paperless voting machines statewide. So those states are Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Texas. And so perhaps outside of Texas, there are no, all of the battleground states use hand-marked paper ballots and/or paper ballots. And this is going to provide a paper trail in the event that anybody questions the outcome of the election or has concerns about the election. And we also have audits that are in place across the country, somewhat on a patchwork basis, and some audits are better than others. And election officials across the country are working largely in partnership with DHS to improve their cybersecurity standards. So I think, there's definitely room for progress. Louisiana, as the one state that continues to use paperless voting machines across the state, is one that I think can really move the needle by just buying new machines. And the Secretary of State there has indicated that he plans to deploy paper-based voting systems across the state in 2021. So we're making progress, but there's still room to go. But I think for this election in November 2020, we will have paper ballots in the battleground states.
There's a lot of change. There's a lot going on. I can't believe you keep your head wrapped around all this. Thank you for doing what you do. So I want to move to cybersecurity because you mentioned it. So voters have shown that they are concerned about voter interference. We know that voter databases have been tried to be breached by foreign adversaries. So can you give us today a high-level landscape of what is going on with foreign entities and our election system?
So, I mean, I think that there's kind of 2 buckets here, right? Like there's attempts to hack our election infrastructure, and then there's attempts to hack people. So from the infrastructure side, we absolutely have foreign adversaries that are attempting to attack our system. And again, to talk about the decentralized system, in a lot of respects, that is an important asset that our system has. It would be impossible to deploy a widespread attack that would impact all of the elections across the country. And in very, very good news, there are very simple common sense steps that election officials can and have taken to minimize the impact of any successful attack. So these are going to be, again, having paper ballots. So in the event that there is any sort of successful interference, that we will be able to go back to that actual record, that paper record, and verify that the outcome is correct. Then what we also have are provisional ballots. So in the event that a successful attack has an impact on the list of registered voters, election officials are prepared to provide provisional ballots, which again are adjudicated on an individual basis in the days after the election. And these are just common sense steps, and these are going to be really good solutions to kind of anything that might happen in the days leading up to and or on election day. And in kind of the cybersecurity sphere, right, you always want to look at measures that are going to prevent attack, detect any successful attacks or detected attacks, and then most importantly, measures that are going to help you recover gracefully. And in these circumstances, to recover from any sort of attack in a manner that's going to have minimal impact to voting. And I think, again, these paper ballots and provisional ballots ensure that election officials are prepared come what may in 2020.
So this begs the question for me to ask you very candidly, do you have confidence in our election system? Can the U.S. be a beacon for the rest of the world?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Even though the president is doubting our election system.
Look, here's what I have trust that we also have courts and that we have the ability to go challenge these. And so, look, do I think that when you say trust, I mean, do I think that there's going to be problems? Absolutely. Do I think that we have remedies for those problems? I do.
Okay, fair enough. So to wrap things up, last question, and then we'll go to Q&A. So I know there has been a lot of conversation already been highlighted of the responsibility that the media has to do with reporting the news. There's also the responsibility of, there's a lot of fake news. So Mike, you're a CNN political commentator. You get asked tons of questions on TV all the time. What do you think the press is doing well now? And what are things that they could be doing that improves in the future that you see as red flags that they're going to start getting this wrong?
Well, your survey data shows that they're doing something right, because if half the country does not expect there to be I'm stunned by that, to be honest with you. I would have been worried that had not permeated to the public enough that they should be wary of looking for election results on election night. And so the fact that, around 50% of the country already understands that may not be true is I think, and this point does the same thing. I think it's a healthy sign. We got to keep explaining that. But look, as someone who works with the media, they do not drape themselves in glory when it comes to these types of issues, and they haven't in the past, because in the end, it's a competitive business. They're trying to get ahead of their competitors. They're trying to make election calls, and they want to get it accurate, but they want to be first. And no matter what happens, that is still going to be the case on election night, is that they want to be the ones to give the information quickly. And so, and again, that may not just be at the presidential level. It gets more complicated down at the congressional level, Senate races, governor's races. Presidential, it may actually be a little bit easier, and there may actually be a little bit less confusion on a lot of the states, because you're just going to have wide margins of victory. And so you're going to get down to a certain number of states where it can be an issue. And look, I think the media understand that they have this responsibility, and they're going to be criticized if they get it wrong, but they haven't really shown in the past that they've been really solid actors about this. They don't seem to learn their lessons about exit polls and things that are not accurate. And so hopefully this is an opportunity for them. It's just going to be very difficult, because it's almost like they're going to be staring at each other with mutually assured destruction of well, I'm not going to say it if you're not going to say it on election night, as we don't actually know who's won, if that happens.
Yeah, I suspect there will be a lot of that going on. We'll open it up to Q&A. So if the producers can help me out and field in some questions for Mike and Liz, that would be amazing.
Thanks, Izzy. We received a few questions from the audience. So let's start with, how do you think all of this impacts businesses? Meaning there has been lots of reporting on companies closing on election day, giving more time off, etc. what else should those companies be aware of and thinking about given all these issues are more present this year than ever before?
Mike, can you answer that one for us?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously being aware of it, being aware in a pandemic of voter behavior and how people are going to react to all of this, I think is important. But I don't know that the election results necessarily affects anyone's behavior. That's going to be what it is, and then we're going to find out when we find out. But in terms of certainly understanding your local election laws, as we pointed out, it's a patchwork, and so understanding where your workers are, if you have different facilities in different places, and just at least being aware of what are they able to do. Informing them is always a good thing to do, but also what their behavior vis-a-vis how they react to their employer when they're trying to vote. Yeah, I think that's a good thing for everyone to be aware of.
Next question.
Another question, how do you see the issues and challenges that formed throughout this year's election influencing future elections?
Liz, do you want to take that one on?
So, the Brennan Center's basic position is the appropriate response to attacks on our democracy, which is absolutely what you've seen from any number of corners this year, is to bolster our democracy. So I think that we are going to see efforts to make what we, norms of conduct in elections, put them in statute. You will see probably, you saw back in the beginning of 2019 that the Democrats at the House passed HR 1, which was a Democracy for All People bill. That included a large number of efforts to make our elections more fair and tackle some of the issues that we've seen with campaign finance and access to the ballot, and again, election security measures such as paper ballots. So I would, depending upon what happens this November, I think there will be a large-scale efforts to bolster our democracy.
Mike, I have a question for you. You have ties across the pond. Is there a difference in how Americans, where the UK election system is edging out or doing it better? Or do you think they're learning from us right now?
Look, no, I think it's so different. And look, we are a continent-sized country, an incredibly diverse country. As we pointed out, we have a federalist system with states having their own election laws. Those sorts of things don't exist in most countries. They certainly don't exist in Britain. They have national election laws, and things are administered from the state. And so, and they haven't had to deal with it during the pandemic like we are getting ready to. So, but I do I think the world will look and see how from how we administer our elections and try to learn how to deal with it during a pandemic. I do think that will happen.
Okay, just want to make sure I got some of that global flavor that you bring to the table.
Absolutely, always glad to talk about Britain.
Next question.
Another one is, do you think we will ever go to a hybrid of online voting and in-person voting?
Ooh, Liz, that sounds right up your alley.
So the reality is that online and internet voting is just not ready for prime time. One of the major issues that security challenges facing the potential for online or internet voting is the fact that, dissimilar to your banking transactions or many other transactions that we all do on a daily basis online or over the internet, when you vote, you have the right to a secret ballot. And there are technological challenges associated with ensuring that voters can securely cast a ballot that is not going to be associated with their information. So kind of pulling those apart is going to be the big challenge facing people as they look for options to do this going forward. And you just saw again earlier this year, CISA and the EAC, so the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, issue guidance indicating that it is exceptionally risky to allow for the return of ballots online.
So technology is do you ever see a day where that could be possible? Like, what is it going to take to get to a digital infrastructure that is secure?
It is going to take a lot more money than the federal government is willing to give in the future that I can see.
And I know, like, I don't know if you're familiar, but like Bradley Tusk was doing, he was very big on doing these pilots, especially I think in West Virginia. Do you see pilots as a sensible way to start examining whether or not there is a role for this hybrid system or not really?
So I think that there is a lot more study that needs to happen by technologists and by cybersecurity experts. Unfortunately, with the pilots that we've seen, the information about the security measures and the information that cybersecurity experts have asked for has not been provided. So there are a lot of questions about the security measures that have been associated with these pilots that have run, and there are, again, cybersecurity experts, academics, and election officials who have so many questions. And certainly for this election, right, as a general rule, you don't want to deploy any sort of new option in the 30 days prior to the election. So certainly for November 2020, it would be inappropriate to implement something like this, which is risky, as DHS has said, and certainly very controversial. I think there might be a path forward, and I think that there are many people that are interested in studying this as we do move forward in an effort to make voting easier. But I don't think that there's a viable option that I'm aware of coming anytime soon.
Mike,
do you have any prospects on?
Yeah, I was interested to hear that.
Does it help Republicans in any way, or Democrats?
I was just more interested to hear that because I'd heard about the military being, in some places, almost forced to do it because you have people that are remote deployed, and so it's interesting to hear that because I wasn't aware that some of those tests are still not being rated very highly by cybersecurity folks, which is a shame, and it's very interesting to hear. I mean, to Liz's point, yeah, you don't want to roll out something new right before the election, which is kind of the situation we're in on writ large this year. There are a lot of new things being rolled out right before an election in states that have to administer them, and that's part of the reason we're having this conversation. So, but look, I think the integrity of a ballot being lost online is precisely the fear that some people have when they talk about their integrity of their ballot. Once you remove the relationship between a voter and an election official, someone who is accountable to the state, that is accountable to the state, having a one-to-one conversation, and when you go to vote, anytime you change that, you start to add layers of complication when it comes to the integrity of your vote. And obviously there's laws written, and Liz has gotten into that in terms of how you can track your ballots and you can pay attention to them, and you can see that voting by mail is secure. But the point is, there are questions around it. That is a thing. You have to be careful with the integrity of someone's ballot when it's not in your personal care. And it's the same issue for voting online. I mean, once if you have to really be careful of the integrity of someone's intentions for who they want to vote for once they send it through some kind of online portal.
Well, I'm personally, as the tech enthusiast of the crowd, I'm looking for the day that does happen, but I totally get that there's a long way and a lot of infrastructure and a lot of technology that needs to be figured out. If OPM can't be prevented, then I don't know how you can get that.
Yeah, the encouraging thing from the test that I saw with the military was it was actually really simplified. It wasn't some super complicated thing. It was essentially like they had a ballot that they filled out online, kind of like a PDF, and then it was just like an encrypted document that someone had to encrypt to get and then print and turn into a paper document further down the road. And so, and I was actually kind of hopeful that would be something that could be utilized by folks in the future. So, that seems to be sort of a simplified way of doing it that might work better than making it more complicated.
I think that's right. We'll take one last question and then we'll wrap it up. So back to you, producers. What do we got?
Great. Last question. What is the best case scenario for this election?
That's a loaded question. I'll try to break that one down. what is the best case scenario as to getting our election results / transition of power? Maybe let's go there.
I mean, I think this is a simple question, right? A landslide is the best case scenario, and it's absolutely the election officials' prayer across both parties and even nonpartisan election officials. It's just, Lord, let it be a landslide.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and again, not just at the presidential level, but the fewer close elections you have, and the more obvious it is who has won any office, the less these problems we've talked about come into play.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for letting me play host today. I've enjoyed the conversation. Feel free to follow us at BCW Global on Twitter. And our next event is Tuesday, October 13th at noon Eastern. So please join us again. And thank you so much for joining. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.